that we both knew about that. We knew that feeling. And I never thought it affected my music until years later.
For more than 60 years, Paul McCartney has been the smiling, charming face of rock history, the man everyone assumes loves every genre, every band, every musician. But behind the polite interviews and the carefully chosen words lies a truth even his biggest fans rarely hear. Paul has a competitive streak sharper than a razor, and there are certain bands he could never stand, groups that pushed his buttons, challenged his pride, or dared to threaten the legacy of the Beatles. These weren't mild dislikes. They were deep artistic resentments he only revealed in private conversations, long after the cameras were off. And when the truth finally surfaced, it shocked even longtime Beatles insiders. Because the first band on Paul's reverse order blacklist wasn't a small rival. It was one of the most beloved groups in American music history, the Beach Boys. Paul McCartney may act polite in public, but when it comes to the Beach Boys, especially Brian Wilson, the cracks in his composure have always shown. Paul never denied he admired Pet Sounds, yet admiration was only half the truth. Underneath it sat something far more human: fear. Brian Wilson was the only songwriter who ever truly threatened him. The Beatles were untouchable, until the Beach Boys released an album so sophisticated, so emotional, so harmonically advanced that Paul lost sleep over it. The rivalry was subtle, but relentless. Brian pushed Paul artistically, but Paul pushed back with quiet competitiveness. When asked about the Beach Boys in private, Paul often downplayed their brilliance, calling their music lovely but simple, a remark that deeply hurt Brian. Paul wasn't being cruel, he was protecting his ego. Beatles history insiders say Paul hated feeling second place, even for a moment, and the Beach Boys were the one band that almost took the crown. And yet, the rivalry was strangely beautiful. Without Pet Sounds, there would be no Sgt. Pepper. Brian elevated Paul, just not in a way Paul was willing to publicly confess. But if the Beach Boys were the rival that kept Paul up at night, the next band, the Bee Gees, were the ones whose success bruised his pride. The Bee Gees didn't just dominate the charts. They steamrolled everyone in their path, including Paul. During the height of disco, the Gibb brothers became the most successful chart-topping band in the world, breaking records Paul once believed were untouchable. And that, more than anything, made Paul deeply uncomfortable. The truth is simple. Paul disliked the Bee Gees because they succeeded in a lane he never tried to control. They rewrote the rules of pop, just as the Beatles once had. For a man who spent decades at the top, watching another group become the cultural heartbeat of the world was painful. McCartney insiders say the Bee Gees' success came at a moment when Paul was struggling creatively, making their rise feel like a spotlight on his own stagnation. Publicly, Paul stayed diplomatic. Privately, he dismissed disco as fast food pop and claimed the Bee Gees chased the charts instead of reinventing them. He avoided mentioning their names in interviews during their prime, especially after Saturday Night Fever became the biggest soundtrack in history. But rivalry is still rivalry. And if the Bee Gees irritated Paul because of their success, the next band angered him for an entirely different reason. Because to him, they were imitators, not innovators. If there was one band Paul McCartney could not tolerate, it was the Monkees. And the reason was brutally simple. He believed they were created specifically to copy the Beatles. To Paul, the Monkees were not four musicians. They were four actors hired to pretend to be a band. And nothing enraged a real songwriter more than an imitation. Paul complained privately that their television show was a Beatles-light circus, and crew members claim he would actually change the radio station if a Monkees song came on. He didn't see them as rivals. He saw them as a corporate experiment, a manufactured product designed to capitalize on the Beatles' success. And in Paul's eyes, that was unforgivable. Even when the Monkees eventually started writing and performing their own music, Paul still didn't consider them legitimate. He felt the damage had already been done. The industry comparisons irritated him, and moments where people called the Monkees the American Beatles drove him crazy. An infamous story from 1968 confirms the tension. During a party in Los Angeles, Mickey Dolenz attempted to strike up a friendly conversation with Paul, only for Paul to politely nod, then immediately turn and walk away. But for all Paul's annoyance with the Monkees, the next band stirred an entirely different emotion, the uncomfortable realization of being imitated too closely. Oasis. Paul McCartney didn't hate Oasis at first. In fact, Noel Gallagher worshipped the Beatles, and Paul liked being admired. But admiration slowly turned into irritation when Oasis began copying Beatles' sounds, attitudes, and even album aesthetics so blatantly that it crossed into parody. Paul was blunt in private. They have the swagger right, but where's the originality? What bothered him most wasn't Oasis loving the Beatles. It was Oasis behaving as if they were the Beatles. Things truly escalated when Oasis publicly declared, "We're bigger than the Beatles." To Paul, this wasn't confidence, it was disrespect. At the 1996 Q Awards, Liam Gallagher asked Paul for an autograph. Paul allegedly smirked and said, "I don't sign for plagiarists." Whether true or exaggerated, it became the defining rumor of their feud. Paul didn't see Oasis as a threat. He saw them as loud kids bragging about wearing someone else's crown. But irritation is still irritation, and the next band on Paul's list pushed that irritation into outright anger. Because if Oasis annoyed Paul, the Sex Pistols insulted him. Paul McCartney respected experimentation, but punk rock crossed a line he never accepted. And no band represented that rebellious chaos more aggressively than the Sex Pistols. The Pistols didn't just reject the Beatles, they openly attacked them. They mocked Paul as a corporate dinosaur, accused him of selling out, and even used Beatles posters for target practice in their rehearsal room. Sid Vicious once confronted Paul in person and sneered, "So you're the sellout? Nice to finally meet you." Paul was furious, not because of the insult itself, but because punk rejected melody, harmony, and musicianship, the very foundations of Paul's identity. To him, punk wasn't music, it was vandalism with guitars. Paul also believed punk culture was disrespectful to the musical legacy he helped build. He didn't dislike their songs, he disliked their philosophy. In private, he joked that the Pistols sounded like a garage door slamming repeatedly. The Sex Pistols represented a movement built on tearing down the past, and Paul McCartney was the past. But as offensive as the Pistols were, nothing compared to the rivalry that defined Paul's entire career. The Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones were not just another band Paul disliked, they were the Beatles' greatest rivals. Even decades later, the tension never fully disappeared. Paul always insisted the feud was friendly, but his comments tell a different story. In private, Paul repeatedly called the Stones a blues cover band who got lucky. He believed they followed the Beatles' lead at every turn, album concepts, visual styles, even the rebellious image that defined their early years. In 2021, Paul reignited the rivalry by saying, "The Stones are rooted in the blues. The Beatles had a wider palette." Mick Jagger fired back immediately. "One band is still playing stadiums, the other doesn't exist." Paul hated being compared to anyone, but being compared to the Stones was the most painful. They were the only group close enough in success to challenge his status. The charts, the critics, the fans, everyone framed them as the two greatest rock bands in history, forever locked in competition. In truth, Paul respected the Stones deeply, But respect doesn't erase rivalry. And for Paul, the Rolling Stones were a mirror reflecting the one thing he could never fully accept: that even legends can be rivaled. In the end, Paul McCartney's hidden list of bands he disliked isn't really about hatred at all. It's about what happens when a man who helped define modern music is forced to live in the shadow of his own legend. For Paul, every band on this reversed list represented something deeply personal. The Beach Boys challenged his genius. The Bee Gees challenged his chart dominance. The Monkees challenged his authenticity. Oasis challenged his originality. The Sex Pistols challenged his values. And the Rolling Stones challenged his crown. These weren't simple grudges. They were reflections of Paul's greatest insecurities, insecurities he couldn't admit publicly, but ones that shaped him as an artist and as a man. Paul McCartney has always been a paradox, incredibly confident yet quietly sensitive, endlessly creative yet fiercely protective of his legacy. These rivalries fueled that fire. Without the pressure of Brian Wilson, he might never have pushed himself to make Sgt. Pepper. Without bands like Oasis or the Bee Gees, he might never have felt the need to reinvent. Even the punk invasion forced him to rethink what music meant to a new generation. In a strange, almost poetic way, these bands helped him remain relevant long after the Beatles dissolved. And that's the truth behind the drama. Even a Beatle can feel threatened, challenged, or overshadowed. But instead of letting it break him, Paul transformed rivalry into fuel. He kept writing, kept evolving, kept proving why he is one of the greatest songwriters in history. Because the legacy of Paul McCartney was never built on perfection. It was built on competition, passion, pride, and the relentless desire to stay on top. And as long as his music echoes through time, no rivalry, not even from rock's greatest bands, will ever take that crown away.